This session is called The Strategic and Operational Reality of War Today. And we have representatives, each of them now retired, I have to say, but recently retired, of the three armed forces of the United Kingdom here. And the brief which they have is to talk about their particular service, what it can contribute, and in particular, of course, what it can contribute to the joint environment and to the interactions with the other services. And they can range between strategy and operations. Indeed, if they want to go to tactics, they can do that. So that the idea is that at the end of it, you will have an overall view of what British Armed Forces today might be seeing as their roles. And to do that, we have Admiral Sir Trevor Soar, who was Commander-in-Chief Fleet, and who will kick off, because we're going to go in service order. Next to him, Lieutenant General Phil Jones, who was the first Chief of Staff of the Joint Forces Command, and therefore went very directly into a joint job across the three services when that was set up. And his last appointment was Chief of Staff at NATO's Supreme Allied Command. And immediately to my left and to your right, as you're looking at him, is Air Marshal Greg Bagwell, to whom we are extraordinarily grateful because he has had his arm twisted at the last possible moment and has agreed to step in or step up or step down, perhaps as he came in from above and down the stairs. And his last job was Deputy Commander Ops Operations at Air Command, in other words, the RAF's operational commander. We're going to say we're going to go in service order. So, Trevor, you're on first.
Thank you. And as Hugh has already made a point, I'll really be talking, first of all, from a naval perspective. But clearly, we all three services work very closely together. And I'm sure at the end of the three presentations, I hope, and if not, we can explain it in questions, how in reality we work very, very closely together. First, the other thing that I'd like to talk a little bit about is what the role the Navy contributes, because for a non-military audience, there's not a good perspective or understanding of really what the Navy's role is, quite often in conflict and warfare. And I'll talk a little bit about how the Navy is evolving as well to meet tomorrow's threats. So I joined the Royal Navy 40 years ago, and in context, we've heard a little bit about that already from the previous speakers, but at that time the British Army was deployed in Germany, and the primary role of the Royal Navy was to protect the sea lines of communication, with a huge investment in the submarine force, which I was a submariner, and our amphibious forces, and to use the surface navy to protect NATO's northern flank in order to slow the advancement of Soviet forces. 1982 saw the Argentine invasion of the Falklands, and again, you're well aware of this, but this was a bit of a strategic shock to the Royal Navy as well, because suddenly we found ourselves deployed the other half of the world in an amphibious task, in a classical amphibious and carrier task group to liberate the islands. And then over the following decade, really the Royal Navy was reconfigured from Cold War anti-submarine warfare to a Navy capable of expeditionary operations. And this is important because this was quite a significant transition from what the Navy saw. And this was bolstered by governments like the Blair government, who saw the services as a force for good and included things like humanitarian intervention. So Sierra Leone 2000 was where we used a classic amphibious task group. Since then, and despite numerous defence cuts, the Navy has continued to change, integrating as a joint force across defence and focusing on having utility, flexibility, and adaptability. And this approach, despite, as we've seen in the newspapers yesterday, but very relevant to all of us, is that despite not having enough deployable assets, especially frigates, the Navy is in a better place to face a very different threat. And that threat includes, through the physical and virtual reach of Daesh, how we see the threats we face overseas now are inextricable from the threats we actually face at home. In Ukraine, we've seen how the line between conventional and unconventional forces is becoming increasingly blurred, often deliberately so. And in the South China Sea, we see how competition between growing regional powers can result in increased maritime territorial disputes. To further complicate matters, more and more people are living in coastal regions, while the technologies which we seek to deny are there to seek to deny navies of freedom of navigation are proliferating. So, as we've just seen off the coast of Yemen. So, how might our future forces evolve in order to operate in this increasing clustered and contested environment? The Falklands experience reminds us the dangers of making predictions, because the world has an irritating habit of confounding even the most widely held assumptions. Nevertheless, I sense no appetite in the UK for a return to enjoying land operations, and Western society in general is becoming less tolerant, particularly as we heard in the last speakers, of the material and human costs of that type of war. Now, what was unconventional in our threats 10 or 15 years ago is now conventional, and our enemies are using all the levers at their disposal for military effect, and our capabilities across the whole of defence must be tailored accordingly. So while the Navy will maintain the minimum critical mass necessary for warfighting and crisis response, the Navy seeks greater flexibility and agility in order to meet these ambiguities in this likely future operating environment. And an effective deterrence is increasingly full spectrum. Deterrence must influence the decision makers. Deterrence must influence the decision makers in non-state actors such as Daesh, cyber criminals, or even revanchist state actors. Therefore, possessing a credible means to project power, whether that be Marines, Special Forces, Army, F-35 strike, as well as cyber, information, warfare, etc., is as important as the provision of the ultimate deterrence through nuclear weapons. By fielding a full spectrum force covering every conceivable threat, yet staying within the realms of affordability as demanded by treasuries, is a significant challenge. There's no point hedging against one threat only to find yourself defeated by an unexpected one elsewhere. Wars will be fought across a number of domains, often at the same time, and delineations between environments will become very blurred. War will be conducted as much in the cyber, space, and information arenas as much as the maritime. So therefore, navies need to remain balanced. It is why, as well as maintaining continuous available at-sea nuclear deterrence, the Navy is bringing into service a proper strike capability alongside with her group warships, submarines, and logistic ships that can face the most modern and capable of potential adversaries. But it's also able to project anything you could wish for, from drones to troops to attack helicopters and so on. And so the Royal Navy must not just be a force capable of high-end warfighting, its principal function, but it must also be capable of providing maritime security against the many other threats the UK faces. Currently, the Royal Navy deploys ships and helicopters and marines to counter migration in the Mediterranean, counter piracy in East Africa, to counter drug smuggling in the Caribbean and West Africa. Now, these are important in maintaining relative global stability and ensuring prosperity through unfettered trade. This is a role the Royal Navy has done for hundreds of years. And so therefore the Royal Navy looks to the future in acquiring general purpose frigates, offshore patrol vessels, increasing the numbers so that this important presence can be felt around the world. Now, Royal Navy ships have developed into flexible platforms that offer great utility, but that will not be enough for the future. They need to be more modular in design so that what was a previous logistics ship is also capable of amphibious assault, of command and control, of launching unmanned submersibles, of becoming a hospital ship, and so on. So flexibility is key. So in summary, the principal challenges of the Royal Navy and how it contributes to the UK defence will be delivered through three activities. That of protecting the UK mainland, our overseas territories, and of course our citizens abroad. So it's a global perspective. Shaping the international environment through protective global engagement and capacity building, working with our allies and our partners, and responding to crisis by projecting military power. And it will do this through effectively 5 specific lines: the carrier strike group, maritime security, the underwater piece, which is really about providing submarines for a task group, and protection of the deterrence, ability to conduct amphibious operations, and maritime counter-terrorism. But today's operational environment demands more than just a blunt force. It requires nuance and sophistication, and there's a huge role for enhanced information exploitation here. Central to this, as already been pointed out by a number of speakers, will be the men and women of courage and skill who build those relationships, exploit the technology, develop understanding, and when required, strike with precision. And finally, on the command and control, I suspect we'll hear a little bit about command and control from my colleagues. In a joint arena, we are of one. In single service operations, which can happen quite a bit in the maritime arena, then that will be run from a maritime headquarters, and quite often that will be delegated out to a maritime commander at sea. That maritime commander may have forces of different countries together there, the coalition, allies, and our partners. So it's a slightly different way of conducting our command and control. And again, we might come back to that in questions.
Trevor, thank you very much indeed.
Thank you. Surfing off the joint context that has just been described by Trevor, my brief for this section of the seminar, as you've just heard, was commendably generous. 10 minutes of reflections on the realities of combat operations from a land perspective, and it's those realities that I'm going to focus on. But my comments are probably more general than Hugh wanted, rather than parochially land-specific, because that's the world that I've lived for the past 15 years in the operational environment. And I'm very conscious of the fact that in land campaigns, this is a field where so much has been said by others far more erudite than me that it's hard to know how to contribute to a seminar like this without being obvious or banal. As President Obama said at one point during the NATO summit in Wales, the thing is, everything that needs to be said has been said. The trouble is, not everyone has said it. So with that in mind, let me offer a couple of observations from a practitioner's point of view of modern land warfare, the realities of which that come straight from some of the scar tissue that I carry. First, a seemingly obvious point. War is seldom quick and never simple. A war means a campaign means strategy, strategy means complex balances between ends, ways, and means that need to adapt in an agile sense over time. And the reality is, when you're locked into this, that there are often very few real, crystal clear strategic choices in war and conflict. Wars more often choose you than them. The other parties to the conflict, not just the enemy, but the other parties to the conflict, all get a vote. And the constraints, such as resources and political will be utterly finite, but also will be utterly changeable on an almost daily basis. And those strategic choices that do have to be made are often muddied by the conspiracy of optimism that often exists, particularly in the early days of campaigning. And strategic choices in modern conflict are not made by single entities sitting around tables supported by clear and understandable flows of information. Strategic decision-making in reality is an exceptionally tough, often deeply combative and Darwinian process conducted by groups of nations and an incredible array of interested stakeholders over extended periods of time, nudging the ball forward inch by inch. In the world of competing strategic ideas and the extremes of political pressure, it's often the survival of the fittest and the most robust thinking that wins through. Note that that does not necessarily mean that it's the right idea that wins through. Clear strategies that endure over time are as rare as rocking horse breath, ladies and gentlemen, because it's so very, very hard to achieve. The ugly reality of war is that the Churchillian keep buggering on more readily applies, if you'll forgive the Anglo-Saxon term. A couple of years ago, I was chatting to a former Secretary General of NATO about this. He laughed and said that throughout his political life, as he grew more and more senior with more and more responsibility, he had always expected the layer above him to know precisely what was going on, because no one else did. And then he found himself leading NATO in dealing with heads of state, and things, frankly, were no clearer. So the bottom line is that in the absence of the elusive, perfect strategic framework, in campaigns, we more depend on the day-to-day strategic and operational judgment of our most senior leaders to inch our way forwards. Judgment, intuition, and instinct that's been hewn from years and years of combat. And in my experience, as we got to the end of the Afghanistan campaign, we had a generation of operational leaders who were masters at operating in that strategic environment. They understood better than almost anyone how to manage those strategic interfaces, particularly the crisis zone between international politics and military operations. And crucially, how to get strategy implemented. Strategy without implementation is fiction, and the world is littered with fiction. There's no quick or easy bypass for any of this. The extreme strategic excellence of operators such as David Petraeus, for example, in my mind, a true modern great, came from years and years of hard intellectual slog deployed on operations around the globe. My point here is that the search for an elegant winning strategy for a land campaign will often remain disappointing. But in the absence of strategy, it's the quality of strategic leadership that can and often does win wars. My second point, without wishing to murder Clausewitz, the most important and the most fundamental challenge is to understand. This was true in Clausewitz's day and even more true today in this murky world of post-peace, pre-conflict crises. To understand the nature of the conflict, to understand the causes and potential solutions to the conflict, to understand the political, military, social, economic and resource constraints crystal clearly, and most of all, but often forgotten, or at least at the back end of all of this, is to understand the cultural outlook, perspectives, needs, grievances, and aspirations of those in the struggle with you, friend and foe. Without any of this, you find yourself dragged along under the wheels of the conflict, without any obvious route out. Understanding is the most important thing by far, and yet it is often the most difficult and time-consuming to achieve. And the cheerful, casual, innate arrogance of the Western mind often allows us to fall into the trap of believing that our own assumptions are infallibly correct. In war, you keep your mind open and agile, and you use your best possible judgment to find real experts, to give you sound, objective advice. You'll often find that the real experts are hidden amongst those who don't talk willingly to the government and the military. And as a military leader, you often won't like their views. But in my experience, it's vital to find them and listen to them hard. My third point. Innovation and change at the strategic, operational, and tactical levels of war are war winners. They sit alongside deception as an absolutely fundamental principle in conflict. Those who innovate and change the least will likely lose. In this, there's a tension between the inertia of the home base and the warfighter deployed. The home base, to include the political leadership, will likely, often for legitimate reasons, fight against true innovation. Innovation and change in the theatre of war can, by necessity, amount to a threat to the carefully balanced ecosystems and fiefdoms of the institutional base back home. The US Army outstripped us by some margin in this respect in the 2006 to 2009 era. Having stared over the precipice of potential strategic defeat in Iraq, the US Army, under the leadership of George Casey, ripped up its own rulebook, slaughtered its sacred cows, and drove innovation, change, and a culture of rapid learning into the organization at home and in the field. For a while, it was astonishingly impressive. My last point, which has been touched upon by many people, to include Trevor just now, is that in modern land-based campaigns, all conflict is hybrid and all action is integrated and interdependent by design. This modern notion of hybrid warfare that's really caught the imagination at the moment is something that, of course, warrants more debate. But in the one sense, it's little more than the dark side of the counterinsurgency comprehensive approach that's been weaponized and reflected back on us. In that sense, it's something as old as warfare itself. On the other hand, the degree to which it's quickly become established as a strategy for modern state and non-state aggression that picks right at the soft, relatively unprotected underbelly of our liberal democracies and our rules-based world is worthy of serious reflection. And for us in the land campaigns, the overriding forcing function within this is the requirement to unify and integrate the activities of an ever wider network of actors and stakeholders to achieve desired outcomes. And note, ladies and gentlemen, that I said actors and stakeholders, not battalions and divisions. This comprehensive approach on steroids is not something adopted as a tactic. It's the pervasive, globalized, and utterly interconnected environment in which we live and operate on military campaigns. Since World War II, we've been evolving steadily from deconflicting environmental forces to building jointness through concepts such as air-land battle, to ever deeper integration to achieve soft and hard effects at the tactical, operational, and strategic levels. Now, the challenge is to develop and implement ever more integrated strategies that depend on security tool sets that combine all aspects of soft and hard power. And then the challenge related to that is to develop generations of leaders who can operate effectively in that domain. My infantry endnote, which again serves off a point that Trevor made at the end of his speech, is that at the end of the day, success in war, which is much more than winning battles, is dependent on our ability to settle the peace that follows. And this is all about influence, trust, politics, compromise, and concession, and hearts and minds, which is and will remain a deeply human dialogue that at its most effective, face-to-face. In so many respects, this remains at the very heart of land-focused operations, human interaction. We are a long, long way from removing the absolute necessity and burden of that human face-to-face interaction in war, soft and brutal, no matter how many people wish it away with technology. Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed, Phil. Greg.
Thank you, Hugh. It's the fate of an airman to always be last, but it's actually quite an advantage sometimes. So I've just written my speech. As a young 23-year-old young man, a tornado pilot, which as far as I was concerned was a very glamorous job, I had a bit of a wake-up call as I arrived on my first squadron, and I strapped into my aeroplane with 2 nuclear weapons under it on a 15-minute readiness to fly in targets in Eastern Europe. That was the mid-1980s. Some of you may not even remember that. Since then, I've been involved in Iraq more than once, Afghanistan several times. I was the air commander for the Libya campaign at the beginning, and for the last 3 years have been commanding armed forces from the Air Force to fight in Iraq and Syria. And it feels like I've spent most of my time engaged in operations. But today it feels more like I felt when I was 23 than perhaps it has felt over the period of the last 30 years. But we might come to that in questions. I echo what both my previous speakers have said, and just following on from Phil's point, I think one of the challenges for the military is we're not only taught, but I think we're sort of genetically predisposed to seek certainty. We love to plan, and we will plan forever if given the opportunity to do so. But in order to plan, we need to know what you want us to do, and we constantly ask that question. I've learned over the years, there's no disrespect to anyone in the room who may have left it very recently, politicians don't like that. They like as much time and space to make their commitment at the last safe possible moment, so they give themselves room for manoeuvre. I completely understand it, but the two are sometimes deeply incompatible, and it's one of our greatest frustrations. And that then sort of plays into how we view strategy and how some other people might view strategy, which I think is our cross to bear. I'm going to cover a few points looking at the joint perspective, but from an airman's viewpoint, because I think it is slightly unique. In some ways it makes us more distant, in other ways it makes us take a broader perspective, and I'll try and cover both of those. We've got to remember that really the way we find ourselves today is very much shaped by the last 15 years of what I would call very low-tech counterinsurgency. It has not involved the true panoply of air power capability. In fact, far from it. It's merely scratched its surface. And there is a danger, of course, that that becomes the new norm. You either make your investment choices or your training choices, and you begin to get very good at functioning in that space. But what you are less good at is adapting to whatever else might be just around the corner. Trevor talked about that challenge of trying to operate across the full spectrum. We have been very lucky, probably since the Falklands. We have managed to operate under almost near impunity from enemy air attack. And that makes life much, much easier, I can assure you. As much as Daesh and others may talk about how they will beat the West, it is not a very nice existence, living 24/7 under constant surveillance, knowing that you can be hit at a moment's notice. That is no place that any soldier would wish to place themselves. But I think we need to be careful about resting on our laurels. That may not exist in the future, and certainly there are peer competitors out there that will absolutely contest that, and we need to think about what that means. Also, you could be forgiven for thinking that Afghanistan is Helmand-shaped, because the UK understandably focused on where UK troops were both engaged and clearly taking casualties and dying for the cause. Airmen thought Afghanistan was Afghanistan-shaped, and our tornadoes could find themselves from one end of the country to the other in about 30 minutes. So we took a much broader perspective of the campaign. And the way that air power is employed is, in order to make sure you prioritise it correctly, you have to be flexible enough to employ it wherever it is. So it was always deeply frustrating to be criticised for not be supporting British troops when you were actually supporting American or Afghan troops on the eastern border, who were in a much harder firefight than perhaps the British troops were at the time. And it's very difficult to make decisions about where you prioritise, but it is an airman's lot, and it does mean sometimes being spread quite thinly. You've also got to remember we had the luxury of resupply, despite the fact we were in very remote places, and able to bring people back to world-class medical facilities within an hour of injury, and quite frankly, you had more chance of surviving a nasty accident in Helmand than you probably do in Cambridge today. And I don't mean that jokingly. I genuinely mean the quality of the medical care that we had available to us in Afghanistan was second to none. But will you always be able to operate like that? And what it meant, I think, in particular in Afghanistan, is we had a rather sterile battlefield. There was almost tactical politics, that every little piece of bad news had to be avoided. Every single thing that might go wrong, that might be a headline the following day in the newspaper, had to be avoided. And those constraints ended up, if you like, tying commanders' hands behind their back because of the considerations they had to make about the tactics or the operations they wished to embark upon. And we couldn't hide from that glare. It's very much a reality today. I think one of the things that's frustrating for all of us here on the top table, it is very difficult now to find people in government who have a deep, innate understanding of the military instrument in all its understandings. It is a very complex beast. The nature of modern warfare is very intertwined. And being able to understand how and what you might achieve with the military instrument is so important to our understanding. And there's one thing that frustrated me deeply is I don't think we did enough what-ifing together. We love to do wargaming, red teaming. Actually, everybody does it. You probably do it at home when you're worrying about whether you buy a car or have a holiday. You know, you go through a mechanical process to make a decision. I would love to see us do that more often with our politicians, to what if and think about how you may deal with a threat. I think you'd be surprised to know how little that happens. And that means when you're making decisions, do you truly understand the consequences of the actions that you take? And I would argue sometimes we haven't. We've also begun to think that all wars will be bloodless. Now, I know Afghanistan was a hard graft in the army with the 450 plus casualties, but when you think about it, and you look at the celebrations or the commemorations of the Somme and other things, that was a whole different problem. And where is the national psyche in terms of what it is really will be able to absorb in terms of casualties and risk should the requirement necessitate it? And there's something there we need to think about. The problem for poor old airmen is that we're often seen as the easy solution. It is very easy to commit air power into a conflict. It seems like the quick thing to do, and it is quick. We can get to places pretty fast. We can have an effect fairly quickly. And 9 times out of 10, particularly in the last 15 years, we can do it with relative impunity. No casualties, no blood and treasure lost. Politicians, why would they not like the easy choice? Well, I can tell you now that dropping a bomb in some place, in some foreign country, does not win you wars. And the understanding, therefore, that those quick fixes necessarily provide you with good strategic choices or a long-term strategic aim achieved is very, very far from the truth. And it is, unfortunately, a bit of an airman's lot that they'll find themselves straight in at the front end. And over a beer, I can tell you about how Libya started, because I was in the headquarters on that Saturday when Mr. Sarkozy announced that the French aircraft were going in, and we were told to just follow them in. And I said, what for and who against? And I was told, you figure it out when you get there. And that's the reality. If you have to do something, then you're going to have to do something, and you're going to have to figure out what to do and learn in contact, and then move it from there on. And it is just the nature of how things, as Phil says, sometimes things happen to you, and you have to learn how to cope, which is when the strategic leadership really begins to kick in. Final point really about airmen as well, in terms of when you're in a US-led coalition, you have to accept the fact that you're probably also being led by US policy. We may like to believe that we're shaping the policy from inside the coalition, and we try to, but actually, 9 times out of 10, you'll find that direction of that coalition and the might of the power that the US bring to the fight means that whether you like it or not, there is a heavy US policy bias. And you need to understand what that might mean in the future and recognise, therefore, what it does mean to be part of a coalition and how you may play. And we pride ourselves in the UK of not being a burden on the US partners in coalition. I wouldn't suggest that other countries are quite as easily won over in terms of how they assist, and some of them will put all sorts of rules and regulations in the way. The UK tries not to do that. But it is something to think about. You've now embarked on an operation, and now you need to understand what you can actually do politically wise. I think what we saw in Libya as an example is we saw a US brought heavily into that conflict, but I think very reluctantly. And in the end, they were trying to backpedal out of it and couldn't find a way out. And I think what we saw then is the way the campaign then began to be shaped when you couldn't really work out who was pulling the strings. And that makes it very, very difficult for military commanders down inside the command chain. The final point, I think both my previous speakers have covered it, is the idea about joint operations in the modern world. There's now a new phrase. There's no joint. We've moved on from joint. It's now apparently called multi-domain. It's the same thing. But if you imagine bringing in information, space, and cyber, which are universal, so the idea that you will have 3 separate single-service command cells that will somehow agree a means by which they task space, use cyber, or exploit information, without somebody coordinating sat above that, is probably much more difficult to understand how that would work most effectively in the future. And so how we begin to work in this multi-domain environment. My personal view is I think the Americans have invented multi-domain because they still can't do joint. And they can't. So they've had to try another word to see if they can find another way of making the argument work. I think sometimes here in the UK, if I'm brutally honest, I think we've had to make joint work because we don't have enough capacity to do it on our own anymore. Occasionally, yes, in very small slivers. But I think now the ability to not work together, we would fall apart and pretty much be divided and conquered. But when you're working in those coalitions, when you're working in those multi-domain environments, how do you set your risk appetites? How do you get your policies to align? How do you get your rules of engagement to work together so that you don't become a burden? Because the danger is when you have singly focused enemies, and we can all think of some, who will make decisions far, far quicker and maybe be far happier to take greater risk than you are, they will operate far quicker and far more nastily than you're prepared to. And unless you've got a better capability, you will lose. Thank you.
Greg, thank you very much. Can I just say, partly to guide the discussion, it seems to me we've had 3 very interesting presentations, but they fall naturally, it seems to me, into 2 arms, if you like. One side is, how much of this in reality can the UK any longer do on its own? There's a sort of British defence policy set of questions. Can we really do full spectrum force? Can we hedge against all threats, the sorts of things that Trevor Soar was talking about? Can we pursue balance when we have diminished resources, and so on and so forth? And then leading on from that, the issue of, assuming that isn't the case, that we are operating with partners and that is how we get essentially the full range of capabilities, precisely how does that work out? So, Greg's final point about we might just do joint in part because we're not strong enough to do things individually in terms of services, but we also do things in alliances because actually we might not be strong enough to do them as the UK, and indeed we very rarely have done things recently as the UK. So what are the political aspects of that relationship? And that leads on to the second set of questions, which I think Phil brought up particularly powerfully, which is indeed reflected by everybody here. I think both, I said Phil, but Greg and Trevor, which is what do we mean by this operational strategic interface? Very striking for me that Phil talked about operations looking upwards and the way in which you could affect strategy. If you'd asked in the 1980s how most people saw operations, they would have looked downwards to the tactical interface because they were looking at the sole context, to go back to that issue of context, of northern Germany. And the pressure, the political context, the strategic contexts were both clearly set. So how do you look at that relationship? Can strategic leadership, as he said, provide a substitute for the absence of strategy? I think we have plenty of examples of that, of being that. You can have wonderful thinking, but it might not happen in practice because you don't have the leadership. What is the role, if you like, of wargaming, or indeed of training, in helping you come to terms with how you actually do that in practice? And I think many of us will recognize exactly what Greg said on that score. And where does that leave the ends, ways, means relationship? Now, I haven't got that quite in the right sequence, but given that each of the levels of war will have their own relationships of ways, ends, and means, and there's a capacity for, if you like, the ends at the operational level perhaps to trump what the political end might be, that it can develop its own momentum, query in Libya in 2011, apropos of our previous discussion about, raised by Chris Parry, about how did that operation assume a different direction from what had originally been approved by the Security Council resolution. So, I think what we might try and do, if we can, is observe some sort of division to try and give the discussion a focus. I mean, in other words, the sort of UK and allies relationship set of questions about capabilities, because people here are perfectly capable of answering those questions, and the much bigger and perhaps more important question, which is how does all that relate to how you do war, which is what, after all, we're here for. And I'm going to be guided by whoever asks the first question as to which route we go first. And there's a question there. Just wait till the mic gets to you, sit right in the middle there. And it won't go to in either of those directions.
Tim Cribb of this college. We've heard about war as self-defense, war as gaining territory. But thinking of the full spectrum operations that we've heard about and the need, for, at least for this country, to operate in cooperation with others, what about future wars which are likely to be over resources? I'm thinking of global warming. And those are going to be pretty colossal, I would imagine. Very large scale, but of a different kind, I speculate, from what we've been used to. Are people thinking about how to prepare for that?
Right. I mean, I think there's probably, within that, the question about global warming goes in both directions. I mean, first of all, are we going to fight wars over global warming as a result of global warming because of perhaps the resources? And is the fact that they will be about global warming likely to affect the way in which they're fought? Trevor, I'm going to put to you first.
In the last Strategic Defence Review, these things were looked at. In particular, I think they called it the Future Operating Environment 2035, and they talked about global trends. Global trends, some we heard earlier on about shift in balance of power, but included things like climate change and therefore the need for humanitarian assistance. There was a talk about urbanisation, people moving from, look at China and how the movement of people is happening there. The resource scarcity, could be a catalyst for interstate warfare, be it oil or whatever it may be. And then really the fact that the demography, more and more people are living closer to the coast, and therefore with global warming, you suddenly find there are going to be a lot of issues there. So we can all say that there's a range of things that may happen that we may become involved. And it's a bit like, I think Malcolm Rifkin made the point that you've got, and certainly Nick Houghton made the point, about the utility of military forces. Because we prepare for the high end, but actually the reality is that we can be used across a whole range of activities, from the humanitarian assistance to stopping immigration to counter drugs, all the way up through to high-end war and conflict, which will be, I think, in a coalition, an alliance with partners or whatever. So from the Navy's perspective, it's about utility across the range of activities. And I think to some sense, and I'll let the others answer, it's also the other two services as well.
Phil?
When the question was asked, I smiled across there because, of course, this was the global strategic trends
I thought you might be, yes.
that we talked about earlier in terms of things that are predictive and predictable. Of course, when people talk about strategic shocks, of course, in many cases they're not shocks, it's just they happen faster than one would expect, or slightly dislocated from the continuum that we're expecting and things like that. But the way the military system works, the reason why Chris was so proud of his global strategic trends is because it's a fundamental step in military thinking to get us where we are today and trying to be predictive about the future. And of course, when you're predicting the future as military people, you want to be as less wrong as you possibly can be, because you're never going to be right. So in amongst those things that Chris and his team worked on all those years ago, of course, climate change and everything else, I think he may have even mentioned it, was one of those. And the sort of things that are going to be things right at the heart of crises and conflicts in the future. And what happens to that thinking? Well, that thinking then gets mapped out by us very sort of framework-driven and engineering-driven military minds to work out, well, if that is the trend, what are our combat forces going to be able to need to do in those sort of circumstances? And when you're looking at things like urbanization, conflict change, mass migration, and all those sort of things. And if you try and work out conceptually at least in an outline idea of what it is you think that people might need to do, and some of those ideas are beyond the edge of technology and beyond the edge of our current capability, that you then have to work out how you're going to get there in terms of kit, people, modus operandi, force structures and everything else, and you slowly build it over time. So, of course, people are thinking about the effect of climate change, and it's impacting now in terms of conflicts over water and mass migration and the great urbanization that's going on and things like that, and are trying to work out exactly what it is we need to do to recalibrate to deal with that. Another angle on resources piece that I've mentioned a couple of times, of course, is that resources as a young infantryman are the furthest thing from your minds. By the time you get to run these things, they're the thing that sits in the forefront of your mind all the time. Because the simple math, the simple physics, is that in campaigns, less equals longer and probably more dangerous. More equals shorter and probably less risk at the end of the day. Greg?
Yeah, just one real thought here. I mean, I think this is stand fast where the resources themselves will actually become a cause. I mean, they clearly could. But actually, I see the whole sort of global situation as a strategic game of chess that we probably are playing better, or at least trying to play better than we sometimes look at strategy in a rather more localized sense. We are not currently based in the Middle East just to fight Daesh. We were there for other reasons and will continue to be for other reasons. If I tell you, if you visit the US Air C2 Centre, they spend about 80% of their time watching Iran, not watching Syria and Iraq. We'll give you an understanding of there is a deeper strategy. The situation in Syria and Iraq is probably as much, if not more, about Russia and its future intentions and posture than it is necessarily about the situation in Syria. And you can't say that in public, because that's not what the conflict looks like to someone watching the news. But actually behind that is a far greater strategic challenge. And we're only just beginning to see Russia and NATO trying not to square off, but looking exactly like they are. Now, is that a battle for resources? It's certainly a battle for space. And I mean that with a small s, in terms of how these different organisations begin to manifest. and then we have the Far East and China and the challenges out there. So I think we are already thinking about how we play that longer-term strategy, and the military will have to play its part within it as part of the deterrence, hopefully, to stop the very war you describe.
Alan Packwood.
Alan Packwood from the Archives Centre. Just following on from that question, really, I just wondered to what extent the members of the panel feel what level of input they feel the military should have actually into identifying risks for the politicians, and having identified those risks, then if indeed they are identifying them, what input do they have into the process going forward?
Let's reverse the order. So, Phil, do you want to go first?
Well, I think it's been touched upon a couple of times before. The General mentioned it earlier today, that this is a dialogue. There is this sense that this is a binary discussion, that the military at some stage in the decision-making process comes up with its advice and presents it in some antiseptic form. It's just not like that. It's a dialogue, it's a conversation. It's a conversation in the MOD between the chiefs and the ministers. It's a conversation between ministers across NATO or whatever coalition you want. It's a conversation that unfolds. And for sure, there are decision points, but as I pointed out earlier, from my perspective, I ain't seen many of those decision points over the past 15 years. You've seen events unfold, and you've seen a series of decisions that cascade around them and things like that. And what we military people do, more than anything else, is identify risks. It's what we're all about in terms of our planning, our thinking, is calibrating risks and talking to people about the risks, particularly in the light of things like Chilcot, or whether they're not, almost the point of constipation in some respects. So at what level should we input risks into that military political interface? Well, there are, if you want to get pedantic about it, there are points in the planning process where you do that formal risk assessment and people make judgments around it. But that's a waypoint in many respects. And it's a crucial bit of the dialogue at all times. The issue that the Americans would point to in terms of our own culture in this is the military have been less forthright than we should have been, less direct than we should have been at that military political interface in terms of that sort of, I don't like the term speaking truth to power, but in terms of, there was this expression that unfolded in the past 15 years of, I think, politically aware military advice that the Americans really disliked, and they felt it led us up the wrong path at sometimes. That there is that we have an obligation to ourselves to be as direct and honest and truthful as you possibly can in that conversation.
Either of you want to add that?
Yeah, I feel like I'm just on countdown. I've just written down the same answer as Phil. I have to show it to you. Yeah, politically aware military advice.
You're allowed to say that.
Yeah, thanks. I was working at the PGHQ where we actually had it written down as part of our remit. And I happened to have the opportunity to sit in a small room with a current Secretary, Minister of Defence, and asked him whether he recognised that term and what he felt about it. And he, bless him, was rather surprised. He said, I don't want politically aware advice from you lot. I want good military advice. I'm the politician. I'll do the politics. And I rather liked that answer. I think there does need to be a degree of separation of what military people, through their own judgment, their own experiences, enables a politician to understand what they're about to embark upon. What could that mean? How many casualties will I take on day one? How many will I take by the third year? How many things might I lose? Could I win? Could I lose? It's absolutely right and proper that military provide that advice. And when told to get on and do something, they then get on and do it. They've had their say. But it's for politicians to sort of think about the nuance of how that might play, both within the electorate, because we're in a democracy, but also within the broader coalition or the wider world in terms of effect on UK interests. So I do think there needs to be some healthy debate between the two, but there needs to be some separation. I've watched with some interest how many generals retired are walking into Donald Trump's golden doors and wondering whether that's healthy. That if you had an entire defence network run by ex-soldiers, not having ex-soldiers, but ex-military people, I do slightly worry about that. It feels to me that might just start to blur the lines. But I also think the military perhaps need to find ways to have those conversations in private. And in the past, I think we've been a little neutered And when you do speak up rightly, you might find yourself on your ear or perhaps not progressing as fast up the promotion chain as you would see fit. And somebody found himself on the front page of the Sunday Telegraph once. I can testify to that. I happen to believe I was right, but there you go. But I think it is something the military have a responsibility to do, but I think there's a sensible balance there in democracy of how that is actually debated and then decided upon.
I think just to finish off, it's pretty disappointing actually, cross-government. All governments talk about how they work across government, but the reality is they work in stovepipes, and that if there's an initiative that's being driven, it's normally resource-driven. So I would love to see a cross-government perspective, you know, the what-if type of approach that covers all the realities or the risks that are there across that this country may face. Quite often, we talk about the risk, but we don't do anything about it till it happens.
Roger, I take it you wanted to come in on that point.
Yeah. Just say one thing, which is that it's published in the Chilcot report, so I'm not saying anything outlandish. As an example of the chiefs not giving the government proper advice and going into Afghanistan when we were already committed to Iraq, on the basis of the Defence Review in 1998, which said that we should be able to put one brigade on the ground on an enduring operation. The military advice failed to say, you should not be even thinking about this, we haven't got the resources to do it. And as a result, neither Afghanistan nor Iraq went in any way according to plan. And that's an example, a negative example, but they should have not been politically aware. They should have given military advice and said, this is what you gave us in the way of resources, this is what we're capable of doing, don't go.
Thank you. Paul Rogers. Sorry, but just, Paul, are you on this point? Or are you also? No, it's not on this point. Is anybody, I've got three others I know want to ask questions. Who's on this point? And then we can come to Paul's question. Or are you all on different points? Sorry? Different points. Okay, Paul, it's over to you.
Paul Rogers from Peace Studies of Bradford. I should hasten to say I'm regarded by my colleagues as being at the hard end of peace studies, and I've lectured at defence colleges for many years, and I'm an honorary fellow of the Joint Service College. I'd like to put a question to each of our panellists, operational but through also to longer-term implications. On the Army side, the Irish Army is regarded as a bit of a sick joke, but in fact it's quite small, about 6,000 or 7,000 people. It's been involved actively in peacekeeping operations for every year except 4 in the last 40 years. And its losses in peacekeeping have been equivalent to more than the losses of the British Army in the Falklands, Iraq and Afghanistan. Why is it the British Army, in spite of its success in UNPROFOR, does not seem in a position to embrace UN peacekeeping? Is it political? I find it difficult to believe it in the Army, given the sort of teaching that Debbie Goodwin and her people do at Sandhurst. I'm really quite intrigued at that. On the Air Force, when the P-8s come in finally in 2019 through to 2022, after something like a 12-year gap, we will finally have long-range maritime reconnaissance, not dependent on the French or the Canadians or some rather limited Hercs. Why have we had 11, 12 years of a gap in what is meant to be a leading maritime nation? And on the Navy side, and this isn't specifically from me, it's what you pick up in gossip in the bars late at night in defence colleges. You certainly find among the Navy, people are seriously worried about the Navy realistically in the late 2020s being essentially a two-ship Navy, able to put a major carrier task group to sea and keep a boomer at sea at any one time, and not very much else. Is there not a fear we're putting too many eggs in just 2 baskets?
Right. While the mics say could just go across, to you, and then we'll go behind. And while that's happening, where do we start? We start with peacekeeping, Phil.
Well, I mean, you answered the question yourself to a degree. Some of it's political, some of it's priorities, some of it's resources. I mean, don't forget that we've had one of the longest-running peacekeeping operations in Cyprus that's manned by an army battalion. With the way we have seen ourselves, certainly conceptually, in terms of being an interventionist army, is that that sort of Bosnia cry of get in fast and get out quick, and being at the leading end of this, that we're not necessarily best styled or would we particularly want to get into the business of protracted positional operations that ties up a huge amount of expensive resource? And let's not forget, we're pretty expensive. The British Army is expensive in comparison to some of the terrific Bangladeshis that I've worked with over the years. And so there's a number of reasons. And I think that in terms of the Army recalibrating its thinking post-Afghanistan, and re-engaging with many parts of the world where it hasn't been engaging recently across Africa, Southeast Asia and elsewhere, that there is this discussion going on as to whether we shouldn't find the resource and the prioritization to get people back into peacekeeping operations. But what we tend to do, as we do in the Congo and Mali and places like that, is put people into the leadership. Not the leaders of the operations, but the chief of staff or the head of operations. You have a smattering of staff officers in most UN operations today.
I think on your question about two-ship navy, I mean, the reality is that, and it was very clear in the newspapers yesterday with the House of Commons Defence Committee report, that we don't have enough seagoing assets. And that's come about through a variety of reasons, but mainly the classic defer, delay, descope approach with funding. Talking to First Sea Lord, as I've been recently, about how he sees the Navy, he basically sees it at the bottom part with going upwards. He would say that, wouldn't he? But the 2% GDP, whilst some may argue it's not enough, is certainly for the first time we're seeing expansion. The reality is the Navy has been hit very hard with assets, and it's going to take a little while to recover. Likewise with its manpower and its ability to man those ships and submarines in the future. So I would say that the Navy is not in a good place today, but the reality is that it is going to see increased funding, and those ships, if they're delivered on time, will start to increase that. But we've cut the Navy too much. I mean, this is not new. I mean, Nelson said, you know, if I die tomorrow and you cut my heart out and cut it in two, you'll find want of frigate stamped in my heart. And the reality is today.
Thanks, Hugh. Why no MPA? Well, the very simple answer is in the 2010 STSR, it was the thing that was easily takeable, and it had a large sum of money attached to it, which was very attractive to someone who was looking to balance the books. Was it the right strategic choice? I don't think any of us would say it is, but the hard economic facts at the time made that choice for some too easy to take. A slightly deeper reasoning, Nimrod had had a rough ride, not only with the new aircraft, but also the older aircraft, the Haddon Cave report, etc. I think BAE Systems also have some degree of sort of involvement in this at the time with the negotiation over the carrier contract, etc. So who knows what might have gone on. I mean, the fact that they were wantonly destroyed sort of implies there was something a bit more sinister going on than just a simple cancellation of a programme. But just one word of warning, you know, buying a few MPAs that, by the way, we're going to use to protect the deterrence, check the UK borders, look after the carriers deployed, and maybe give it a nice star roll on the back of that as well for wide area surveillance over land space with 9 aeroplanes. Good luck. And I think what the UK has to eventually probably come to terms with, unless it's going to get a lot more money, but we all know where that's going to come from, just maybe we can't be quite as exquisite in every area of defence as we currently aspire to be.
Are you trying to come in specifically on maritime patrol aircraft? Right, in that case I'll go in the super. And I'm looking at you for the clock. Yes, go ahead.
Hannah Scott, studying modern global history at Oxford. Just returning to the theme of multi-domain operations, my question to the panel is regarding their thoughts on the possibility of greater integration of military forces of the EU member states, especially whether, given Britain's exit from the EU, will leave us out in the cold, or whether it was in fact a lucky escape for our operational integrity, and also what this means for NATO. I mean, indeed, is this even a viable project, or is this just a discussion that's being bandied around in Europe at the moment, given the identity crisis going on right now on the continent?
Okay, who would like to take the European question?
Well, I don't think that Brexit means that we won't operate with EU forces. I mean, we have command. We Brits have command of, at least the last time I looked, we did, of one of the long-running EU missions, which is Op Atalanta, which is the counter-piracy off the east coast of Africa and Somalia and that sort of thing, which actually has been a pretty good operation. And, you know, it is our style to denigrate those sort of things because they're small, they're bespoke, they're niche, and they tend to be at the softer end of engagement, and they tend to be following French foreign policy quite closely. And so it irritates a bit on many levels. But actually, if you look at them, some of them are actually pretty good and pretty effective and quite useful. And of course, what the EU has that NATO doesn't have is when you look at the comprehensive approach and that great sort of let's bring in the economy, let's bring in legislation, let's bring in sort of all those other instruments of power, informational domains. The EU is pretty good at that and has lots and lots of money. And money is a weapon system, one of the biggest and most effective weapon systems. To stop theirs and to have yours is an extraordinarily effective position to be in war. And they're good at that, and the EU has lots. So I think we will operate with the EU. I can't imagine we won't. And it makes sense to do so. We have capabilities, niche capabilities we'll offer and all that sort of thing. What does it mean to NATO? Well, I suppose one could say that the default setting for hard power in Europe now sits with NATO. Because without the Brits as part of some sort of formalised European construct, then NATO is the place you have to go to for hard end of warfighting and warfighting thinking and warfighting doctrine and warfighting strategy and everything else. In some respects, that may clarify the situation between the EU and NATO, which is murky at the interface at the moment. The best possible result that could come out of it is a much closer working relationship between NATO and the EU around security in its more general sense, to get over some of those firewalls that are largely emotional that I talked about before.
I've been allowed one more question by my controller, so I think we go there.
Hazem Kandil of St. Catherine's College. My question has to do with strategic choices. So the policymakers in the UK and the US are coming under increasing domestic pressure since the Second World War to choose the strategies that would be quicker and cheaper, which might be a contradiction, to use violence but to use it moderately, which might again be a contradiction. And the result of that is that the strategies that are chosen are usually not necessarily the most effective ones, but the ones that are quick and cheap and quiet and, that keeps the military away from the headlines. Now, with everything that's going on today, whether in the Middle East or in Russia and Baltic states and so on, where's that direction heading? Is it towards the military coming under more and more pressure to follow strategies that are more domestically acceptable, even if they're not effective, even if they end up wasting more resources and more lives, or the populations of these countries, again, especially the UK and the US, readjusting their expectations and understanding that commitment to war would require more sacrifice, more resources, and possibly more use of violence than it is to their taste. So which of these directions seems realistically to be the direction where war was heading in the future?
Okay, Rice, big question, and we've got about 1.5 minutes max to answer it. So each of you's got 30 seconds. Greg?
30-second answer. I think usefully, this is where Mr. Putin just might be doing us a favour, because I think it's forcing us to think more strategically and about the longer term. Had we continued to fight in these relatively small, I use that word advisedly, counterinsurgency type operations, I think we would have continued on the path you've just described. I think now the clear and present danger requires us to think differently now.
Again, I'd agree with that. I think our relationship with America is absolutely key as well. So we'll see what the Trump effect is, but it could actually enhance NATO rather than undermine it if we start to see our European partners put more money, more of their GDP into defence. So we may end up with an ability to make some proper strategic choices rather than resource-driven choices.
Irrespective of the direction of travel, the moral and ethical dimension is our vital ground in all of this. And I don't know if that answers your question, but you seem to point to some choice between moderating violence or not, and those sort of things. But whichever position you find yourself, whatever strategy you find yourself being carried along by, that touch point, that moral compass in amongst all of the things that we get up to, that moral and ethical position, as I said, is our vital ground.
My apologies to those of you who I know were
knowing the right people. Yes, thank you. It's very brief. For the first two-thirds of the 20th century, the relationship between the wider British public and the military was very close. I don't see that in the last third of the 20th century, nor in the 21st century. In other words, the wider public knows nothing about the military other than what it reads in headlines in newspapers. What are you doing collectively to try and influence the wider British public for your interests, which are our interests? We hear bleating about the NHS and all the rest of it, but we do not hear much about the military. What are you going to do to improve that relationship so that you then have more power with politicians to influence them when they're handing out resources? Thank you.
Right. Trevor.
Well, I'll kickstart. It's a really difficult one because certainly in my 40 years in the Navy, we've been arguing this about sea blindness, people not understanding what the Navy is about. Should we have a body like they have in the US that is a powerful body that really knocks at the door of government? The answer is we don't, and it worries me. I mean, the reason we've got 3 retired officers here is actually because we feel quite passionate about getting that message across.
Greg, anything you want to say?
Yeah, I mean, become president of the Air Power Association, a fellow of RUSI, and come to Cambridge and talk to an august audience like this, and have a Twitter account, which is only so much you can get in 150 characters, which I think was what you're seeking because you're in a hurry. Yeah. But it is important to keep the debate going, and as much as I still think the British public like their military. Generally, not senior officers, we tend to be the ones that make all the mistakes apparently, but trying to ensure that they understand the military instrument I think is the key.
Well, within the constraints in which we operate, which are fairly finite in terms of the political permissions to discuss what we do with the public and all those sort of insecurities that we suffer from, we have a reasonably sophisticated approach to engagement. I think we eke out quite a lot from what we do in terms of the way the MOD operates and things like that. Of course, it's an enduring concern. It always will be, it always has been, it always will be in the future. Are we understood enough? Then absolutely not. Could we do more? Probably. But we're having a good go at it most days.
The challenge does seem to me to shift from sympathy to empathy. I mean, the public appreciation of the armed forces is as high, if not higher, than it's ever been. The challenge, of course, is to allow them to be usable. Right, please join me in thanking our panel.